A mother of 3 stopped answering her phone, and when police were asked to check on her, it looked at first like a routine welfare call. But as the days went on, the case kept taking one unexpected turn after another, and none of the detectives working it imagined where it would eventually lead. Kristil Grimsmud was born on November 24, 1980, in Boulder, Colorado. She grew up in a big, loving family and fell in love with dance early on, constantly performing in different shows. She was also drawn to science and graduated high school with top marks. Because of that, Kristil earned a scholarship to one of the most prestigious colleges in the country, where she started studying biochemical engineering. A little later, she transferred to the University of Colorado and finished her degree there in the same field. After graduating, she got a job at a local company that developed scientific equipment and software. It was a pretty competitive position with a very high bar to get in, and Kristil was hired largely because of her outstanding academic record. She quickly proved herself to be a key employee, and over the next few years, her career kept moving steadily upward. Around that time, she met a man named Daniel Krug, a data analyst at the State Department of Public Health and Environment. In 2007, the two got married, and over the next few years, they had 2 daughters and a son. From then on, Kristil and Daniel focused on raising their kids and lived a pretty quiet, steady life, until everything suddenly changed in 2023. In early October, when she was 42, Kristil woke up like any other morning, getting ready to send the kids off to school, when something on her phone caught her eye. It was a message from a man named Anthony, someone she dated in college 23 years earlier. They'd been together for about a year before breaking up, and since then, they'd barely stayed in touch. It already seemed strange that Anthony was reaching out after more than 2 decades, but what really threw her was the content of the message. He wrote, "Hi Kristil, it's Anthony. Hope it's okay I looked you up. I'm in Boulder every few weeks and thought we could hook up. You game?" Kristil found the whole thing really odd. It was obvious Anthony was just trying to set up something physical with no strings attached, and she had zero interest in that, so she decided not to respond at all. The next day, he messaged again, and this time the tone was completely different. He went straight into insults, cutting out the profanity. It was basically, "Are you there? You should say yes when I offer a pity F. Whatever. I saw your pics. You got fat. Bet your loser husband won't F your fat C. Don't waste my time." Kristil couldn't understand why he was talking to her like this. Since their breakup, they'd only spoken a few times over the years, and those brief conversations had never been flirty. Just quick check-ins about life before they drifted out of touch again. About 5 years earlier, he'd messaged her out of nowhere and tried to reminisce about the relationship. But Kristil told him she was happily married with 3 kids and wasn't interested in any kind of fling. After that, he blocked her on social media, and they hadn't spoken since. Now, he was back, acting completely unhinged. Kristil found herself wondering what had happened to him in all those years they'd been out of contact. But despite the nasty things he'd said, she decided not to escalate anything and simply ignored his message again. For a while after that, Anthony went quiet, and Kristil started to hope he'd finally left her alone. But almost a month later, a 3rd message came in, and this one terrified her. Anthony sent a photo of her husband getting out of his car in front of the building where he worked. From his clothes, Kristil could tell the picture had been taken that very day, which meant Anthony hadn't just figured out where her husband worked, he'd gone there and watched him. Along with the photo, Anthony started insulting her husband and added that he should drive more carefully because something on his car might end up getting damaged. So now, this wasn't just name-calling anymore. It was a direct threat. Kristil was scared he might actually hurt her family, so she decided she had to go to the police. On Halloween, she filed a report, explaining everything that had been happening and attaching all of Anthony's messages, along with the photo. She also made it clear that she had never given him her phone number, email address, or any other personal contact information. The only way they'd ever communicated was through social media, and none of that data was listed on her profile. Police took the report, and 2 days later, a detective was assigned to the case. While he was still getting up to speed, Anthony sent another message. This time, he wrote that her license plates were expired and she should really get them renewed. He added that he'd also checked her husband's car and his plates were still fine. Kristil, who genuinely hadn't realized her plates were out of date, now knew for sure that Anthony had her home address and was actively watching her. Not long after that, he sent her a photo of genitals and another semi-nude picture. Then other men started messaging her, saying they'd found her number on a hookup site. That's when Kristil realized Anthony had started posting her number on adult websites. Over the next few days, Kristil was living in constant fear, and what terrified her most was the thought that Anthony might somehow go after her children, who were 14, 11, and 8. Before long, the detective asked her to come down to the station, and she sat with him and went through everything that had happened, telling him how scared she was for her family's safety. He promised to look into it, and Kristil waited to hear what he would find out. About a week after Anthony first reached out, she went to a dentist appointment. When she walked out of the office and checked her phone, there was another message from him. This time, Anthony wrote that he'd been watching her during the appointment from his car, and that he'd performed a sexual act on her vehicle. Kristil drove straight to the detective and showed him the message. She pointed out that no one knew she had the dentist appointment, which meant Anthony literally had to be following her around town and tracking her every move. The detective told her he'd uncovered a few important details. Anthony wasn't using a normal phone number. He was messaging her through an app that assigns users random phone numbers, which makes them hard to trace. On top of that, the detective found out that Anthony did have a personal Verizon cell number, but he never used it to contact Kristil. He stuck to the anonymous texting service. In other words, he'd set things up so it would be difficult for police to prove he was the one behind the harassment. After leaving the station, Kristil went straight home and locked herself inside until her husband returned. She was too afraid to drive anywhere, knowing Anthony could be nearby at any moment. After the day at the dentist, Anthony suddenly went quiet again, and over the next couple of weeks, Kristil started to think he might finally have backed off. But on November 12th, about 6 weeks after the very first message, he reached out again. This time, he went back to pushing her for something sexual and wrote that he was willing to get rid of her husband because he didn't satisfy her and she was supposed to be with Anthony instead. He added that the security at her husband's workplace was terrible and that he'd been able to walk into the building without anyone stopping him. Kristil was panicking. At the moment she read that message, her husband was actually at work, so she called the police right away. Officers went to Daniel's office, checked the building, and didn't find Anthony anywhere. They also couldn't confirm that he'd ever been inside. But on one point, he wasn't lying. The building's security was extremely lax, so it was entirely possible he could have slipped in unnoticed. A little while later, he messaged again and said he was still waiting for her approval to take care of her husband. Meanwhile, the official investigation wasn't going anywhere fast. The detective found out Anthony moved constantly, which made it hard to pin down a current address. The only solid information he could get was 2 previous addresses in other states, one in Idaho and one in Utah. He also tried to get a warrant for account records tied to the messages Anthony was sending, but someone at the police department messed up the paperwork and the judge denied the request. They had to start the whole process over, and since the case wasn't classified as an immediate life or death emergency, getting that warrant could take weeks. In the end, Kristil and her husband basically had to start doing their own legwork. They dug up everything they could find about Anthony in open sources, old addresses, phone numbers, anything, and handed it all to the police. Daniel also hired a private investigator and installed security cameras around their home in case Anthony ever showed up there. Even with all that, the police kept working the case at a slow, cautious pace. They didn't even try to contact Anthony directly, saying they didn't yet have enough to confront him. All of this took a serious toll on Kristil. She was afraid to leave the house, jumped at every phone call and notification, and more than anything, she was terrified that Anthony might shift his focus to her kids. And through all of this, the messages kept coming. They weren't as openly threatening as before, but he still made it very clear he was watching them, commenting on where she'd been and sending more photos of her husband taken in different parts of town. This went on until December 14th, 2023. 2.5 months after Anthony first reached out, Kristil's husband called police and said she hadn't answered his calls or texts for 3 hours. He was at work in a neighboring city, and Kristil should have already been home after meeting with the detective to hear about any progress in the case. With everything going on with Anthony, Daniel immediately started to panic, but he couldn't get back quickly enough to check on her himself, so he called the police and asked them to do a welfare check. Detective Martinez, who was handling the case, was alarmed right away. He didn't have any meetings scheduled with Kristil that day, and she hadn't reached out to him at all. Officers started to wonder if she'd discovered something new or was planning to bring them important information, headed to the station, and for some reason, never made it there. They drove out to the house, but no one came to the door. The officers walked around the property several times, peeking through every window they could, but saw no movement inside. At that point, Daniel was already driving home from work, and the kids were still at school. While they were waiting for him to arrive, the officers decided to check the small garage windows up near the ceiling. The main windows were covered with curtains, so they couldn't see in. But they pulled the patrol car right up next to the garage, climbed onto it, and looked through the high windows. As soon as they did, they saw a woman lying motionless on the garage floor in a pool of blood. They called for an ambulance and forced the front door, then rushed into the garage. They immediately recognized Kristil. She had no pulse, but her body was still warm. Paramedics tried to resuscitate her, but there was nothing they could do. From the very beginning, detectives could see they were dealing with a homicide. Kristil's body showed obvious stab wounds, and there was a blood stain on the wall next to her. Her body was sent to the medical examiner while officers started working the scene. First, they confirmed there were no signs of forced entry anywhere in the house. When police arrived, every door and window was closed. Another strange detail stood out right away. The front door security camera that Kristil and her husband had installed just a few weeks earlier had been covered with duct tape. Around the house, there were 3 more cameras, but all of them had been switched off right around the time of the murder, so detectives couldn't pull any useful footage. Afterward, all 3 cameras came back online as normal, which led police to believe the killer had managed to disable them only for the window of time needed to commit the crime. Kristil's body was lying at the bottom of the stairs leading from the house down into the garage. Her purse and car keys were on the floor next to her. It looked like she'd been about to go somewhere when the attack happened. Detectives also noticed something else. Inside her purse was a handgun that she and her husband had bought after all the harassment and threats from Anthony had started. For some reason, Kristil never even got the chance to pull it out, which raised a major question. Whoever attacked her had to get into the house without leaving any trace of a break-in and hit her so suddenly that she didn't have time to react. One theory was that the killer had gotten hold of a spare key and hidden it in the garage, waiting for Kristil to come down the stairs to leave. The medical examiner later found that Kristil had been struck twice in the head with a blunt object and had a stab wound to her side. All of this fit the idea that she'd been taken completely off guard. It looked like the killer had hit her before she could even reach for the gun, leaving her no chance to defend herself. From the very first hours of the investigation, detectives were convinced this had to lead back to Anthony, the man who'd been stalking Kristil for months. Now that the case had been reclassified as a homicide, they quickly got a warrant for his arrest and began searching for him. Before long, they learned he might be living in the neighboring state of Utah and reached out to local police to check the address on file. Officers went to that house, and sure enough, Anthony was there. They started asking questions, but he acted like he had no idea what they were talking about. When they asked when he'd last been in contact with Kristil, he told them it was 2014, 9 years earlier. He insisted he hadn't spoken to her since, and absolutely had not been stalking her. Detectives hadn't really expected him to confess on the spot, but things quickly started to get strange. Utah officers had shown up at Anthony's home just a few hours after Kristil was killed, and he was calmly sitting in his living room. The problem was, the drive from his house to Kristil's town was about 8 hours. Investigators checked whether he could have pulled it off by flying back instead, but found no record of him on any flight, and even by plane, the timing would have been extremely tight, if not impossible. On top of that, around the time Kristil was murdered, Anthony was at a store with his wife, buying a sweater. That was backed up by solid evidence, so detectives suddenly found themselves asking a disturbing question. Was it possible that Anthony had sent all those messages but had nothing to do with the actual killing? Anthony stuck to his story. He said he hadn't messaged Kristil in years, and even let police go through his smartphone without a warrant. Given that the stalker had used anonymous apps with different numbers, detectives didn't really expect to find a neat, obvious trail on his phone anyway. They considered the possibility of a second phone or a laptop being used, but Anthony told them they could check all his devices, and they still didn't find anything useful. Digging deeper, investigators eventually concluded that Anthony had been in Utah the entire time, including during moments when the stalker was telling Kristil he was watching her. So not only did detectives fail to link Anthony to the murder, they'd practically proven he was unlikely to be involved at all. Unless, of course, he'd somehow pulled off a plan so intricate the police simply weren't capable of untangling it. Looking for answers, investigators finally got the warrants they needed and brought in the department's tech unit. Digital forensic experts started digging into the stalker's messages, his accounts, the photos he'd sent, and every bit of data they could pull. Before long, they tracked down an IP address and discovered that the messages were being sent over Wi-Fi from a specific location. But it wasn't in Utah, where Anthony lived. It was inside the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, the exact building where Daniel, Kristil's husband, worked. Detectives, who had not been expecting that twist at all, started digging even deeper. The tech team told them all the messages had come from a so-called burner phone, and when police traced the purchase, they found it had been paid for with a gift card. Store records showed that the card had been issued in Daniel's name. After that, detectives went back to Kristil's friends and family, and they added even more context. It turned out that before the stalking ever began, Kristil and Daniel's marriage was already falling apart. She had told people close to her more than once that she was planning to file for divorce and that she couldn't stand living with him anymore. Her mother also mentioned that Daniel could be rough with the kids and even hit them. Because of that, Kristil was planning to seek full custody and use photos of their bruises to make sure he'd never be able to hurt them again. By then, Kristil and Daniel had been living in separate rooms for quite a while and had basically split their finances. But once the messages from Anthony started, her focus shifted almost entirely to dealing with the stalker, and the divorce plans were pushed to the back burner. Once they had all of that in hand, police asked Daniel to come back into the station. This time, they started carefully feeling him out, without putting all their cards on the table at once. At first, the detectives walked him through where the investigation stood and mentioned that Anthony had a rock-solid alibi, at least for the time of the murder. Daniel said he had no idea who, other than Anthony, would want to hurt his wife, and added that now he was afraid for himself and his children, because the real killer was still out there. That's when the detective slowly shifted the conversation to what the tech team had found and told him that the stalker's messages had been sent from Daniel's work Wi-Fi. Daniel immediately offered an explanation for that. According to him, Anthony had come by his workplace, taken photos, and even gone inside the building more than once. Everyone there used the same Wi-Fi password, and the login and password were posted outside each office, so Anthony could have easily seen them while walking through the department. But the detective told him that still didn't really add up, and then laid out a different theory, one very carefully worded so it didn't directly accuse Daniel of murder, but nudged him toward admitting that he'd been the one behind the stalking. The detective suggested that, with the marriage falling apart, Daniel might have come up with a plan to keep Kristil from leaving, and at the same time test whether she'd be interested in another man. So, he started messaging her as her ex, trying to pull her into something sexual, and when that didn't work, he escalated to threats so she'd feel genuinely unsafe. All the while, Daniel was ramping up security at home, hiring a private investigator, and playing the role of protector, hoping Kristil would decide she needed him and shouldn't walk away and face this danger alone. The detective was hoping Daniel would at least admit to being the fake Anthony, which would make it much easier to link him to the murder later. But Daniel kept insisting he had nothing to do with any of it. With nothing concrete to hold him on, they had to let him go, and kept looking for more evidence. They confirmed that only 2 people had the passwords to access the home security cameras, Kristil and Daniel. In a previous interview, the detectives had asked Daniel why the cameras suddenly went offline around the time of the murder, and he hadn't been able to give any kind of clear explanation. They also learned that on the day of the killing, Daniel showed up to work about half an hour later than usual, which, in theory, gave him enough time to commit the murder and get rid of evidence. Since Kristil's body was found around noon, that meant she must have been lying there for several hours before he called police. Daniel, for his part, said the reason he was late was nothing more than diarrhea. According to him, he'd just spent that extra half hour in the bathroom. Sometime later, Kristil's mother shared something else that bothered her. She'd been staying at the house full-time, helping with the kids, and in the very first days after the murder, she noticed Daniel was already throwing out Kristil's clothes and other personal things. He also told her he planned to sell the house as soon as possible. On top of that, he didn't seem grief-stricken or even particularly upset. Instead, he was mostly irritated that the police were looking at him and kept complaining that they were trying to set him up. All of that was still just circumstantial and hard to rely on. But soon, detectives got something much stronger. Over several days, they collected footage from all the home security cameras up and down Kristil's street. After watching hundreds of hours from different angles, they were confident that not a single unfamiliar person or vehicle had approached the house that morning. With the way all those cameras overlapped, it was basically impossible. In other words, if someone else had killed her, that person would have had to show up on at least one of the neighbors' systems. Since no one did, police were left with only two options. Either Daniel, who was already in the house, committed the murder, or the killer somehow materialized in the garage and then vanished off the street without being seen. Detectives also pointed out that there were no signs of forced entry and no evidence of a struggle inside. Even though the marriage was in trouble, Kristil simply didn't believe her husband would try to kill her, which is likely why she never even reached for the gun in her bag. Eventually, detectives put together a full picture of what they believed Daniel had done. In their view, he hadn't set out to kill his wife at first. He started stalking her under Anthony's name to scare her out of filing for divorce and keep her in the marriage. Maybe he thought she'd be too afraid to move out and take the kids away from their father, terrified that Anthony might target them. Or maybe his plan was to make Kristil see how much he cared about her and her children by stepping in as the protector. On top of that, detectives believed he was deliberately sending threats about himself from Anthony and taking those creepy surveillance-style photos so Kristil would start worrying about her husband, hoping that fear would rekindle whatever feelings were left. But then, they say, things started to spiral. Kristil was far more terrified than Daniel had planned. She started digging into Anthony's background, looking for information, and staying in constant contact with police. Daniel realized that if this kept going, his entire lie could be exposed. And if that happened, he could be facing real criminal charges. In that scenario, he might lose custody of the kids, his reputation, his job, essentially everything. Backed into a corner of his own making, Daniel, according to detectives, decided to kill her, telling himself there was no other way out. He hoped the police would pin everything on Anthony while he stayed free with the kids, the house, and the money. On the morning of the murder, he stayed home longer on purpose, waiting until the kids left for school, and then followed Kristil into the garage as she was getting ready to go out. There, he allegedly caught her off guard and hit her in the head several times with a heavy object, hard enough to knock her unconscious. After that, Daniel took a knife, stabbed her once in the side of the chest, and then drove to work, getting rid of the weapon and any other evidence along the way. On December 16th, 2 days after the murder, police arrested Daniel on 3 counts: first-degree murder, stalking, and impersonating another person. He pleaded not guilty and hired an attorney, and preparation for trial began. It started in April 2025, and by then investigators had even more evidence tying him to the crime. On the day of the murder alone, Daniel had been Googling things like, when does a head injury become a reason for concern? How hard do you have to hit someone in the head to knock them out? And how long can someone be unconscious without brain damage? On top of that, an ex-girlfriend from his high school and college years reached out to police. Their relationship had ended more than 20 years earlier, but what she described fit Daniel's pattern disturbingly well. She said that after they broke up, she started getting messages from different people claiming to be various friends and acquaintances of Daniel. They all sent her threats and told her breaking up with him was a huge mistake. Eventually, she figured out that none of these real people had actually written anything. It was Daniel sending all the messages himself, pretending to be them. She was scared he might act on those threats, so she went to the police and got a restraining order against him. After that, the messages stopped. The defense leaned hard on the fact that police never found the murder weapon, and there wasn't a trace of blood in Daniel's car or on his clothes. But none of that was enough to convince the jury he was innocent, and in the end, they found him guilty. For the murder, he received life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus another 9.5 years on the other 2 counts. And with that, the twisted case came to an end. Because of Daniel's actions, his 3 children effectively lost both parents. They're now living with Kristil's brother and his wife, while other relatives help raise them and try to give them something close to a normal life. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Thank you for watching.